So another one to talk about is let's go back and talk about the census because while a census is an attempt to measure every single person that you can in your sample, and the U.S. Census is an attempt to measure every single person in the United States, some people are hard to get. And so if we really want the most accurate count of people in the United States, then we end up having to do some sampling around the edges for populations that are hard to get. So, what are examples of that? And how would we deal with that? Well, it's already some of that is going to be what I already mentioned, including, first of all, you send out everybody's mailings, then you send them a couple of mailings. If they don't answer the mailings, you send someone to their house. But what do we do with migrant labor? They may move houses in between mailings. It happens. What do we do about the homeless? They don't have some place um, to get mail. This most recent census and political round, there was a whole conversation about undocumented folks. Regardless of your political opinions, if we're doing a census, we're tasked with counting those people. But since they're doing their best to not be on the radar, not be on any official's list, the chance that they're going to fill out the paperwork you send them is lower than others. So, knowing that we have these gaps, how do we figure out who these people are? Um, and it ends up being, well, like I said, we sent them the mailings, we sent them a bunch of follow-ups, we sent some people out to the houses. Now, if we're talking about homeless people, we really legit at some point need to send a researcher out into our town and try and estimate how many homeless people there are. And again, using the same principles that I was talking about before, we want to get to um, we want to get to estimating as accurately as possible how many homeless people there are. That gets to be a little bit of a challenge because how do you get a random sample of homeless people? I don't really know, but it may be that you send someone to homeless shelters and count the number of people sleeping there, 7 nights in a row, and take that as an average. It might be that you send someone to where people are actually doing homeless camps, right? And how do you find folks who are living in their cars? How do you find folks who are unhoused but living on their friends' sofas? All of that comes down to you have to get really creative in your research to find out who those people are so that you can estimate them back into your sample so that you can make a larger estimation back into um, your results, your analysis. So we talked about stratified, which is where you pick three of this, and three of this, or however many you want proportionally. We talked about how the census tries to fill some of those gaps. We talked about just making sure when you're doing your reporting that any bias introduced by your sample is understood and interpreted as part of the analysis. So, but there's one other way to try and deal with this, and this is a little bit like the census trying to figure out who the homeless are by going out and checking them, and that would be you can overweight a sample, and this is kind of halfway in between the census example and the stratified example. For a while, I lived in Gettysburg, which is up in Pennsylvania, Adams County, Pennsylvania. Population of roughly 100,000 people. The town, not so much, but the county was. And the African American population was strikingly small. There were only 1% African Americans living in this county, according to the census. So, this makes a problem because if we say we want to do a random sample. And this is an example we actually built to try and do a survey for a hospital out there. But if we want a random sample and we want to interview, say, 300 out of the 100,000 people there, that's not even 3%. 3% would be 3,000. That's like 0.3%. And we went out and found 300 people, either going through the phone book and sending them emails or calling them or sending them paper mail, whatever. If out of that whole population of 100,000, 1,000 folks are African American, then our chance of 0.3% of the population of even ending up with any African Americans in our sample would actually be pretty small. And you could figure it out. The math is pretty simple. But it would be really likely we could get 300, even 500 people and maybe get one African American. Now, that could be problematic. That means that there's when you break out your research and you say, in our research, in our analysis, this is what the black population said. You're talking about one guy's response. I mean, this is one person. It can't be necessarily estimated to be all African Americans in Adams County from what one person said. And so one of the ways you would get at those smaller groups, well, before I say that, now keep in mind, if we ran a sample of 10,000, then we'd expect to end up with a few African Americans, enough that it wouldn't be a problem. But if we're doing a small sample of, 500, because that's all the time or money we have, we might not have any, or we might have one or two. So then you would actually overweight it. So you would still run your sample. You'd still try and do a random sample and go through the people you need, but you would introduce an element of stratification into it. And that would be, you'd say, okay, we know that 1% of this population is black or African American. So if we're going to do 1,000 respondents, that would be 10 black people. We want to include 20 black people, so that's where the element of stratification comes in. But then when we do the math on the whole group, each one of those folks is going to count for essentially half a person, and at least mathematically. Now, why is that? It's so that your subset of African Americans is actually a larger group of people and therefore more likely to represent African Americans in that community than the, very few number of people you have if you're going for a small sample. So if you're doing that kind of research and you're interested in the people who are mathematically at the margins, you can increase the number of folks you're going to include by some multiple and decrease the weighting in the statistics that you're doing proportionally, and you'll still end up with 1% African American respondents. Only it'll be twice as many, and so they'll be better represented than if you just left them out. So there you go. When I think about sampling, this is the most important stuff you can get. Understanding that first and foremost, a random sample is what allows us to be scientific, period, as sociologists. It's a gold standard. But also unrealistic at times in terms of us being able to actually attain this. So if we understand that every step down from there is some sort of compromise, how do we meet that compromise and not contradict or weaken our findings too much? And so the answer might be a stratified sample. It might be oversampling a particular numerical minority. It might be actually separating our research out. To use the example of, my mom and my kids, if you're going to talk to, instead of trying to get everybody. Maybe just do research that's targeted at elders and research that's targeted at younger folks, and just combine that into a multi-methodological or a multi-part study when you write your analysis. Finally, is going to be, you always, no matter what you're doing, you always need to know where bias may be introduced into your results and your sampling. And then you need to keep that in mind when you write up and advise your clients about what they're going to do. Finally, after all of that, I also want to say it's important not to be too big a purist. Because if you are going to wait around for perfect information, you're not going to ever be able to act. So the question is, how am I aware that my information is imperfect? Because if I am clear on that, I may still be able to act with some efficacy, rather than waiting for perfect research. And perfect research is expensive and maybe even unobtainable. Even the U.S. government has trouble doing a perfect census. So that's good for now. Thanks for letting me do this lecture from the hills of North Georgia in a back bedroom here. I will say, and thanks Dr. Scordato, for letting me come talk to you guys today. If you guys have any questions, and Michelle, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, and I can still come talk in class someday when I'm actually on campus, because I love this subject. It's fun to do, and there we go. So if I'm not mistaken, happy International Women's Day, and thanks for having me chat. All right, bye-bye.